Looks like I'm good to go. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Dr. Mark Bennett, the Research Manager at the Royal Armouries, and I'm delighted to welcome you to today's winter lecture. The Royal Armouries, for those of you who may not know us yet, is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. And if you have heard of us, you might think of Henry VIII's armours, of the Sibbon model of Waterloo, or of our Indian elephant armour. But our collections range right up to the present day, not least thanks to the incorporation of the Ministry of Defence's Pattern Room collection. And today's lecture deals with the more modern side of our collection. Whatever time period you're interested in, whether you want to visit us in person or engage with the collection from your armchair, you'll find more details on our website, which is royalarmouries.org. This talk is part of our winter lecture series, which will run until March 2022, and will cover all sorts of topics relating to arms and armour across the centuries, from medieval armour to autonomous AI weapons. All the talks will be broadcast live on Zoom and YouTube, and will stay available to watch on demand on YouTube if you're unable to join us on the day for whatever reason. If you'd like to keep up to date with what's on, you can keep an eye on our website or follow us on Eventbrite, which is the website that you signed up to get the Zoom link, assuming you do get the Zoom link. If people on YouTube, feel free to join us over there. Before I should start, I should say that there's still time to apply for the museum's first postdoctoral research fellowship, which offers 9 months of funding and research expenses to support a project looking into the history of arms and armour without restriction of geography or time period. So if you've completed a doctorate between September 2019 and October 2021, or if you know someone who has, the details are at tinyurl.com/RA postdoc, all one word, and the deadline is the 18th of November 2021. Please do pass on the opportunity to any discussion groups or email fora you might be interested, that you might be a member of and that might be interested. We would love to give people the most opportunity to apply that we possibly can. So turning back to today's event, you'll have opportunities to ask questions to the speaker after the talk, and indeed a small test of opinion, I think, towards the end of it. So if you're watching on YouTube, you can type your question in the chat box at the right-hand side of your screen. If you're watching via Zoom, there'll be a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen where you can type questions. In terms of the questions after the event, we can't guarantee to get through them all, but we will cover as many as we can. Feel free to ask them anytime during the talk or afterwards, whatever works best for you. So with the necessary preparation out of the way, I'm delighted to introduce our speaker today, David Lister. David is a specialist in the armour and anti-tank weaponry of the Second World War, with a particular focus on Britain. As well as a published author, he's been a historical consultant for companies ranging from Matrix Games to Wargaming Limited, i.e. World of Tanks, although I have to confess I'm only a World of Warships player myself. Today's talk relates to his latest book on British Spigot weapons and asks whether the Projector infantry anti-tank was the best platoon-level anti-tank weapon of the Second World War. So without any further ado, David Lister. Just going to say, David, if you're speaking at the minute, you might need to unmute your microphone, but I fell into exactly the same trap I was warning you about.
Well, that was an embarrassing start, wasn't it, kids? Let's try it again.
Happens all the time. Consider it practice.
Hello, historians. My name is David Lister, and thank you for that introduction from Mark. As you may guess, this is one of the first times I've ever tried anything like this, and it's already going brilliantly. Back in 2013, I started working on Spigot weapons. This was because I'd found some documents at the National Archives. Since then, it's sort of grew a bit, and I put the results of that research into this book, which is available from Amazon and a few other places. I'm sure there'll be a link at the end. Because of this book, the Royal Armouries asked me down here to give you all a talk, and we selected the PIAT because they actually have one in their collection, which is quite an interesting one. So, shall we begin? Before we start, one question which I'm always asked is, what is a spigot weapon? So I'll quickly answer that. If you already know, then I apologise and I'll try to be as quick as I can.
Sorry, David, I might just very quickly cut in again. You might need to share your screen unless this is a precursor to doing so.
Yeah, I didn't hit the OK button.
There we go, perfect, thank you.
Oh, this is going even better and better and better. No, right. What is a spigot weapon? The spigot is the large rod or spigot that sticks out the front of a gun. This normally has a projectile fitted over it, which it consists of a tail tube and the warhead. In between the spigot and the tail tube, you have your propellant cartridge. When the propellant detonates, the expanding gas bubble throws the bomb away to do whatever it's meant to do, and the spigot remains behind. What happens to the spigot then is all depending on what sort of spigot weapon it is. Most spigot weapons are fixed, therefore they don't do anything. In that case, you have to deal with the recoil some other way, usually by transmitting it through the frame of the gun and into the ground. However, just before World War II, a new type of spigot weapon was invented, and this was known as the dynamic or recoiling spigot. What happens, the recoil will force the spigot back into the case of the weapon against pressure from a spring, and it's essentially absorbing the recoil. That invention was invented by this chap. Colonel Blacker here is largely responsible for introducing spigot weapons into the British Army and for creating a lot of the inventions which surround them. In 1933, he submitted his first patent, which mentions the spigot. This was a device to attach to the top of a service revolver to turn it into a grenade launcher. That device, or the one he sketched at least in 1933, was a full-bore conventional style weapon. However, in the notes of the patent, he did suggest you could use a spigot weapon for the weapon. The following year, in 1934, he submitted the patent for this, which, as you can see, is refining his concept and turning it into a spigot. This weapon was actually built and submitted to the British Army in 1937 for trials. These were part of the series of trials to find the British Army's next platoon level mortar, which was eventually won by the 2-inch mortar. The reason why this particular design of Blacker's didn't do very well was initially the Ordnance Board were slightly concerned about it because you could load it in a way which would essentially shoot yourself in the foot, which was considered slightly unsafe. From then on, it was allowed to enter the trials, but it had to be done under special circumstances. And during the trials, it managed about 6 shots and started falling to pieces. So the weapon was withdrawn. However, 2 years earlier, Blacker had invented the Arbalest, this weapon. This is possibly one of the more important weapons in our story, as it has 2 main inventions, which would later go on to work so importantly with spigot weapons. The first is the recoiling spigot principle. As you can see, the case of the weapon has 2 slots down the side with a handle out each side. That's your cocking handles. You pull those to retract the spigot from the loading trough at the front and compress the spring. When you fire, you pull the handle which is just next to the gun sight. It releases the spring. The spring slams the spigot forward and up the tail tube of the bomb and sends it on its way. The recoil will then force the spigot back into the case and recock the weapon automatically. The other invention was to do with the cartridges. And this would be used in every single spigot weapon the British used in World War II, bar one. This design was the radially expanding cartridge, or at least that's what the patent calls it. The cartridge is essentially a tube weakened in the middle. When the cordite or propellant explodes, the tube splits in two, and the walls of the tube are forced into the tail tube walls. This creates a gas-tight seal, which is vitally important with spigot weapons. If you had a tail tube which was the same diameter as the spigot, the weapon would be impossible to load. If you have it loose enough to load, then gas can escape down the side. This is essentially the same problem as the early muskets had when you drop a lead ball down the barrel and fire it. And the same problems apply. You get different muzzle velocities, different accuracies, and if you can't produce a consistent weapon, you haven't got a very good weapon at all. In 1938, this weapon was submitted to the army for testing to replace the 2-inch mortar. Although it worked satisfactorily, it was judged the 2-inch mortar was a better choice, and the weapon was returned to Blacker. In 1940, Blacker took this along to a meeting with Millis Jefferies of Ministry of Defence 1, or MD1, also known as Churchill's Toy Shop. When he showed this weapon to Jefferies, they immediately started developing it, or trying to develop it into a mass-producible weapon, which would serve as an anti-tank weapon for the Home Guard. And most of their problems seem to be related to the recoil system. For some reason, they were trying to use a conventional artillery piece style recoil recuperator, and it just wasn't working. Eventually, Blacker suggested that they switch to a fixed spigot. And shortly afterwards, this weapon entered service, the Blacker Bombard. This gave the Home Guard a colossal amount of firepower. To give you an idea, the Cambridge Home Guard had 8 battalions in its force and 112 bombards. As you can see, that is quite a bit of firepower. Each bombard was perfectly capable of destroying any tank it was going to run into, and if you loaded a different sort of bomb, then it had roughly the same sort of effect as a 3-inch mortar against personnel. So it was a good all-round weapon. I've covered bombards in another talk, which again, I hope will be linked at the end of this video. So we need to move forwards. At the same time as he was working on the Bombard, Blacker was also promoting this weapon, the Baby Bombard, as it was called. I would caution, we don't actually know exactly what the weapon looked like. We've got a word description, but no photographs. So that's an artist's best guess on the description we do have. This was a recoiling spigot design of Blacker's. And as you can see, it was side-loaded using an action very similar to the Martini Henry. As well as this weapon, Blacker was also suggesting a new type of infantry division called the Parthian Division. This had 2 unique characteristics. First, every soldier in the division would be armed with the Baby Bombard. Second, they'd all be mounted in helicopters. And he was proposing this air mobile infantry in 1940. His obvious thinking was it was a way to return to the continent. So he tried that, but the army was not really interested, so the project died off. In service at the same time, the army had the number 68 grenade, which you can see there on the left. This was a very primitive hollow charge projectile. Hollow charge is what we call, or what we would call, high explosive anti-tank or HEAT today. The weapon had a colossal recoil, so much so that you couldn't fire it from the shoulder when you were firing it from a Lee Enfield. You used a cup discharger like you would for ordinary grenades to fire this. With the recoil being a problem, it was decided to create a projector for the weapon, which would fire the grenade, which was already in service. Now, normally with weapons, you sort of establish the requirements first, sort of like what sort of range and how accurate you want them to be. With the number 68 grenade projector, excuse me, their first point of call was to work out what the maximum recoil a human shoulder could take before breaking and set that as the upper limit of the weapon. Everything else was to be derived from that. It was test fired in December 1941 at Bisley. As well as the horrible recoil, there was another problem with the weapon. MD1 had been researching the number 68 grenade and testing it. The weapon was officially capable of penetrating 50 mil of armour. However, when MD1 conducted the tests, they found that yes, it could put a hole through 50 mils, but the effect on components inside an armoured vehicle, such as crew and ammunition, the stuff you need to knock out, was negligible. If you wanted a decent behind armour effect, the most a number 68 grenade could deal with would be about 20 mil, which was roughly equivalent to what a boy's rifle could do. So the number 68 grenade was seen as a bit of a dead end. From there, the Army cancelled the project for the obvious reason that the grenade was insufficient and the recoil was too savage. In the closing notes, they put in the suggestion that maybe a recoiling spigot design weapon could help with the recoil problem. MD1 continued researching hollow charge weapons and eventually came up with this thing. The 3.5-inch projectile, which you can see there, was capable of putting a hole through 75 mils of armour plate sloped at 30 degrees or 115 mils at normal. To give you some idea of what that would mean, that would go through front armour on a Tiger tank. So it was perfectly acceptable. This particular weapon, we do actually know what it looks like, and this is an accurate representation. Unfortunately, I couldn't get the photographs for you because the archive, which isn't the Royal Armouries, I might hasten to add, wanted a rather large sum of money to use the photos in this presentation. On the 11th of February 1942, this gun, which was a recoiling spigot gun, was test fired and given a demonstration in front of a large group of brass and interested parties. This happened, and one of the people there was Colonel Blacker. Now, I've not been able to discover whether Blacker was invited or whether he gate crashed the party, but the net result was he showed up and he had the baby Bombard with him. And this rather upstaged the Jeffress gun and led to a distinct problem for the army, because they now had two very similar weapons using very similar principles, which filled the same role. Which one do you pick? That was all decided on Valentine's Day 1942, so 2 days after the trial, where everyone involved, including Blacker and Jeffries, were invited to a meeting. And this starts one of the big mistakes about the PIAT. Most commentators attribute the design of the weapon to either Blacker or Jeffries, when in fact it's neither. At the meeting, design and implementation of the PIAT was turned over to Imperial Chemical Industries Limited. They in turn gave the project to one of their engineers, Mr. F.E. Smith. He was told to take both weapons, the Jeffress gun and the baby Bombard, and combine them, taking the best features from both weapons and putting them into one gun. The result was the PIAT. Trials were held at Princess Risborough against a Churchill tank. This was one of the development weapons. And as you can see, they placed some wooden mock-ups of crewmen in the crew seats. There's meant to be 5 people there, but as you can see, they got a bit decapitated. With the PIAT passing its trials, it was authorised for mass production on the 1st of April 1942 and entered service in August. From there, in British service, as far as I can tell, it served until about 1956, when it seems to just drop out of service. It gave quite a considerable firepower boost to the infantry platoon. Not only would it tackle a tank, it could also be used to tackle other targets such as buildings, or even used as a light mortar. It was found that the bomb the PIAT fired had a useful shrapnel effect out to about 15 feet. So it was a good all-round weapon, which seems to have served in just about every single theatre of war, including Russia. Some were actually sent there. Which leads us on to the question of, was it the best weapon? Or platoon level weapon, I should say. So I've knocked up this handy little chart. I'm going to say yes, based on the basis of this chart. As well as the dual purpose role of the weapon, it seems to be either the best or second best in each and every one of these categories. Now, I know what you're thinking, looking at the first line, and you're wondering, how can the PIAT be the best if it weighs the most? Well, what good is a weapon without any ammunition? It's not. And this is where the PIAT wins out, because 6 rounds of ammunition was the standard load for a PIAT. And that comes in with the gun at 45.5 pounds. 6 rounds of, or 6 rockets for the bazooka and the launcher were the standard load. And that comes in at about 39 pounds. So there's only 6 pounds difference between it. If you come to the Panzerfaust, however, 6 rounds for that is a whopping 78 pounds. So if you take endurance and needing to carry the ammunition to feed the weapon, then the PIAT does come second. The other thing about this table is you've got your accuracy at the bottom, which isn't really that clear. It's hard to picture what it means. So I've done that. This is, that circle is the mean deviation of your ammunition. So 50% of your shots will go within that circle. The other 50% will go outside of it. And obviously you can see the Panzerfaust is beginning to get worryingly inaccurate at 100 yards. So again, the PIAT does appear to be the better, or at least the second best weapon. But today, the PIAT has a very weird reputation. It seems to be mocked quite roundly for a lot of perceived flaws. And these in turn have led to some inaccurate myths, which I'm going to tackle now for you. The first one, the PIAT is short-ranged. This comes from veteran accounts where they all say the PIAT was a short-ranged weapon. And it is, when you compare it to other British weapons which they would be familiar with, such as the Lee Enfield or the Bren gun. Compared to those, the PIAT is very short-ranged. However, when you look at it in the same class as it, then suddenly it doesn't seem so short-ranged. The boy's rifle is ineffective. Sticky bomb, you have to be standing next to your tank, and the Squirts anti-tank projector has at most 30 or 40 yards. Compared to that, the 115 odd yards of the PIAT is rather long-ranged. And that applies also to contemporary weapons, such as the Panzerfaust, which only has a range of around 40 yards if you want to be effective with it. So it's short-ranged only when you compare it to apples to oranges. Otherwise, it does seem to come out quite well. The second myth, the weapon could not be fired downwards. Now, this comes from modern commentators who look at the PIAT, and when the spigot is retracted into the case of the body, they'll think, oh, there's a bomb in the tray, nothing's holding it there, so it will just fall out. This isn't borne up by veteran accounts, as there's one particular account where a veteran is racing across a ploughed field to get to a location where a German tank has been reported. He trips over and lands face first in the dirt. When he pulls himself upright, the PIAT is wedged by the nose of the bomb into the ground and is sticking up like a tree. He quickly jumps up, grabs the PIAT and pulls the weapon out. The bomb comes out still attached to the gun. He then runs around the corner and starts firing at the German tank. What's going on here is many people are missing an important invention, another one of Blacker's I might add, called the loading clip. And it's those two prongs which stick up on the front case of the gun. These create a small ridge or gap between them and the case of the gun. When you load a projectile, they're all fitted with a guide ring at the base of the tail tube. This slides down behind the loading clip. In this particular instance, I've used the practice round because the diagram has the loading clip removed, or the guide ring removed, I should say, so you can see it. When the weapon is fired, the guide ring either shears off or deforms and is bent around the loading clip and the projectile launched. Otherwise, it holds the projectile in place perfectly well. The last myth was that, and this again comes from eyewitness accounts mostly, was that whenever you fire a PIAT, you must immediately duck, or when the warhead explodes, the tail will hurtle back, hit you in the face and kill you. And at first glance, it seems like the PIAT is being unduly mocked, as usual. Both the Panzerfaust and the bazooka have warheads and tails, yet they don't have this fault. But in this myth, there is actually a grain of truth. It was found that what was happening was the top half of the cartridge, because remember it splits in two, was remaining with the projectile. When the warhead detonates, there was enough force to fire that cartridge top as shrapnel back down the tail tube. If that happened to be pointing towards your firing point, then it could cause some injury, as the shrapnel was clocked at doing about 3,000 feet per second. As this was an undesirable feature, in July 1944, the Mark III bomb shows up. As you can see, it's got two steel discs wanged in the base of the warhead, and this was to stop the shrapnel effect from being blasted out when the warhead detonates. So that one, there is a little bit of truth, but it's, again, it's a sort of grey area. So, for a bit of fun, just to round off the event, when do you guys think it's the last use of a PIAT? If you just type a year into the chat and we'll see how we get on. I'll give you a couple of seconds to do that. Right, if we're ready. Well, we know the PIAT was used in French Indochina, as well as the Israeli wars or Arab-Israeli wars from the late 40s. And we can see French men using the PIAT. Apparently, they're also quite often attached to riverine craft as well to fire directly onto the shore. And that raises an interesting question. A lot of the French weapons were subsequently captured by the Viet Myth, which later became the Viet Cong. And a couple of years ago, this picture surfaced on the internet, and it purports to be Viet Cong people using the PIAT. However, we can't verify where or when this picture was taken, so we can't confirm it. Interestingly, those two are actually using the PIAT in a mortar role, and to my eye, the ammunition looks like it's a little bit wrong in dimension, so maybe it's home-produced ammunition of some sort, which would certainly get around some of the supply issues with PIAT bombs. Very much the same applies to the Battle of Longwala. There are persistent rumours that the PIAT was used at this battle against the Pakistani tanks. Unfortunately, we have no evidence for it. The same also applies to the concept of Iraq using them during the Iran-Iraq War. We know the Iraqis had a large number of PIATs, but were they issued? In reality, we do actually know when the last use of the PIAT was, and it was in 2007, so well done to anybody who suggested that year. This was in America, where a drug dealer had got a hold of the PIAT. He was then said to have fired the PIAT into a lake to overawe witnesses. Now, we don't know whether he somehow had a live bomb and he fired that, which would have been incredibly dangerous if he had done that, or whether he jury-rigged up some contraption to launch a projectile or not. We do know that in 2008, the drug dealer was arrested and the weapon was seized, and there were plenty of the eyewitness accounts to back up the weapon being fired. So anyway, I've probably been rabbiting on a bit too long, so I'm going to hand back to Mark at this point.
I say no, that's absolutely perfect, David. Thank you very much. In terms of the answers that we got through, so bulk of opinion probably split between 1956, which I think would have been Suez, and the Falklands. We did have one 2002 and one 2010. I don't know if they've got inside knowledge of the Sheriff's Department or not, but yeah. So some interesting guesses, a lot of sensible ones, some ones which were shockingly close to the answer. But no, thank you very much for that. It's fascinating, and don't worry at all about the issues to start with. We invite you for your anti-tank knowledge, not your PowerPoint skills, and we really appreciate all our speakers doing something which is not exactly intuitive in presenting. Just to the audience, yeah, if you've got any questions, please bring them in. I can see some people sort of typing away already. But if I kick us off, Colonel Blackard fascinates me. The mentality of someone to look at a revolver and go, this could really shoot something bigger is fascinating. Was the intention to make the equivalent of a rifle grenade for the revolver, or was it always with a view to something bigger?
His idea on those patents was that the grenadier, for want of a better description, could fire grenades in a light mortar roll. If a hostile popped up close to him, he just flicks a lever and he's got a stocked revolver to defend himself. So it's sort of like you're a grenadier, but you don't need to worry about drawing out your pistol. He also suggested that the projectiles which were being fired from it could be normal grenades with the screw plug replaced with a tail fin. So all you need is the normal Mills bomb, replace the tail plug, so you don't actually add in any more ammunition. And should you even need to, you could just use it as a normal grenade. So it was sort of like he was trying to make something multi-purpose,
yeah,
and logistically sound, but not a new weapon.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, rather than stick more gear on the person, actually let them do more. What is the trajectory of a PIAT like? Because it's competing with mortars, and 270 FPS seems quite slow. So how arched is it?
If you give me a second, I will find a picture, which I've got somewhere. I didn't think I need this one. No, that's not the one. Where is it? Basically, what the picture will show, when I found it, yep, here we are. You can see just above his head, right there, That's the projectile, or part of the projectile, as it goes through the air after it's fired. So you can see it's quite a curved arc. I've got accurate curvature arcs for range and time for blacker bombards, but not for the PIAT, unfortunately.
A question from Christopher Cooko is, how tall was Blacker? Because he's apparently dry-fired a deactivated one. He's 6 foot and found he was pulling it to his chin to reload.
That I can also answer. As far as I know, Blacker was entirely normal. As you can see from this particular gentleman cocking the weapon, the correct way of cocking a PIAT, you need to grab hold of the handle and keep your hand away from the...
If you're trying to share a slide, you might have to have another go at it. Unfortunately, I don't think it's come through.
Yep, I made the same mistake twice.
Yes, there we go.
As I say, that's how you're meant to cock a PIAT. You're using the entire length of your legs and your lower body to work against the 200-pound spring. And to do that, you need to grab it fairly far down the weapon. I would also suggest that official instruction is not to dry fire any spigot weapons unless there is a projectile inside the loading tray, otherwise you'll damage the mechanism.
And actually, while we've got that question, a question from YouTube from Frenchy18692. What equipment, apart from the launcher and the ammo, is the PIAT trooper generally carrying?
It's normally a 2-man crew. You'd normally have the second man with a close defense weapon, say rifle or submachine gun, depending on what he wants. He would be carrying the bombs. The gunner would be using his usual infantry kit and the PIAT. They wouldn't normally have packs or stuff. They'd be in fighting order, so most of this equipment would be dropped at the baseline to be brought up later. Usually some water or such forth would be an idea. If we just quickly jump over to that, you can see a PIAT crew, which is in action, and you can see they've got almost no webbing on.
Great. The interesting thing is that obviously this comparing numbers, this looks better than both the bazooka and the Panzerfaust, but I guess to an extent the bazooka carries on in service from what I understand, and then you also get the laws in the America, which are the single shot disposable ones. So I guess, were there any attempts to make a PIAT version 2 for future?
Yes, there were. Again, if you just give me a second, I'll find pictures of it. This is actually one of the mistakes I made in the book, and it's the only one I've found so far. I've had the plans for the Mark II PIAT, so to speak, and I didn't know where it fitted because I only had the plans. So I sort of hypothesized, and I do point out in the book that it is a hypothesis, but that is actually the Mark II. But what it is, it's called the Sue Black Projector, and it's got the trigger grip on the side and it's loaded like that. However, it could also fire anti-tank guided missiles, but it wasn't semi-active line of sight command like modern or early anti-tank missiles. The missile was attached to a battery box, and you had a switch on the box. You could steer it left or right, but that was it. So there were attempts at this. This is entirely from Blacker's off his own back. At the time, the British Army were looking more at a project called Red Planet, which was sort of along bazooka lines.
So just to be clear then, that's the the operator of the weapon would both fire it and then have to press switches to guide it in on its target.
Yes.
It's fascinating. I can't imagine it being much fun in the pressure of tanks bearing down on you, but I suppose it's better than nothing. We had a question from Andrew Tyso on the PIAT again. What was its safety record like in terms of injuring the firer?
I honestly can't tell you, as I've never seen any figures, which possibly indicates that it wasn't as common as many would say, but it was a risk, it was known about, and they did introduce an engineering solution to fix it. So you'll have to take what you can from that, I'm afraid.
Is it a particular popular weapon with the troops? Because you've mentioned that veterans thought it was short range, and there's obviously rumours about it being dangerous. But do they tend to take it to their hearts? Or
generally, they see it. I honestly can't say, as we don't have a great number of people who actually used it in combat. Most of the people who've used it were trained on the weapon, but weren't actually issued it. And it certainly did the job, and it was known to do the job, unlike the Blacker Bombard, which has a whole other story about how it was accepted by the troops. So it's another one of those take your pick your sources and see what comes out sort of jobs.
Without, I guess, going through systematically looking at everyone's reminiscences and doing a conclusion of that, you tend to pick what sort of favours your worldview ultimately.
There's that, but a lot of the interviews were done by the IWM in the 1970s and 80s, at which point you've got to wonder, are they actually remembering what they remembered, or are they having the last 30 years worth of public outrage at what happened in the war added on? Those of us who are either historians or deal with stuff like the police, we know that eyewitness accounts are not exactly reliable. So, especially after 30 years.
A question from YouTube, which is, how viable was recocking it while prone?
It certainly was in the training manual. And as you saw with this guy, I could quite easily see that happening while I'm lying on my back. So it's a case of, do you think you could do that? Is the best answer. Well, this leads into the, sorry, go on.
I was going to say, it's surprising what you can manage when the other option is standing up and being shot at, I presume.
There's that. There's also, I suspect, the impending question of how often did it fail to recock? And again, we've got no figures on that. Part of it may be due to how the weapon was held, because the weapon has the firing of this, because of the guide ring having to shear off or deform, or quite often you'll pull the trigger, the spigot will go forward, but the projectile won't instantly be launched. And it's said in the training material that often soldiers relaxed after pulling the trigger and nothing had gone off. And then that half second of relaxation, the bomb launches. And if it's not held properly, then there's a chance that the weapon won't recock. So whether it was just a training issue you needed to get used to, or whether it was frequent, I don't know. But there you are. I'm saying I don't know a lot here, aren't I?
Well, these are all things to add to the second edition of the book, I suppose. But,
yeah, I've got a lot to add already.
A question about its popular depiction. I don't know if you've seen the Bridge Too Far, but apparently the film appears to show them missing a tank from about 20 or 30 meters. Now, is that an unfair slight on either the PIAT or the training of the British infantry who would have used it?
I would suggest yes. The gun sight, or the rear aperture on it, was set to 70 yards, and 70, 100 and 115 yards, I believe. Under 70 yards, it all used the same sight picture. So it seems perfectly capable of hitting a tank. There is an account from the Durham Light Infantry where they engaged a Panther tank at 15 yards and they hit. This was an untrained person, he hit with every shot.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay. And on the theme of practicality, we've got a question: was the PIAT ever used specifically in an anti-infantry role? And could it be? Because I think the Viet Minh photo you said it was probably being used as a mortar.
That this photo was used. It is showing it being used as a mortar.
Mm-hmm.
There are accounts of it being used as an anti-infantry weapon. One of the few combat accounts we do have from the IWM collection is of a soldier sneaking up on a German machine gun nest with a PIAT and using that direct contact to take care of them. The IWM, the Imperial War Museum, accounts also have the use of it as an anti-safe weapon. I used it to blow open a safe.
Well, I guess that leads us on to another question from YouTube, I guess, which is, apparently India destroyed multiple T-59 tanks using the PIAT. Considering that they're still used on the PIAT on the battlefield, could the PIAT hypothetically be effective on the model battlefield? But I guess it would struggle against compound Chobham armour.
Composite armours would stop the PIAT dead because it's a single hollow heat projectile. Yeah. Against lighter vehicles, it would do as belts as well as any other anti-tank weapon. There would be no real advantage. The only real advantage to a PIAT is you can create silenced spigot weapons. Mm-hmm. So you'd have a silenced grenade launcher, which seems somewhat foolish, as the weapon is silenced, but when the warhead hits, it's going to go bang anyhow. So.
Well, you're only going to be 100 yards away from the tank as well, so they're not going to take that lying down.
When you're inside the tank, it's actually very difficult to see a couple of infantrymen, especially if there's no muzzle flash. So that's one thing in its favour. But against a modern tank, it probably wouldn't be that efficient.
Although I can't remember the exact name of the division, but the idea of air mobile anti-tank infantry, actually, that was remarkably prescient, because I forget whether it was the UK or the US that's trying something very similar at the end of the Cold War.
The Parthian Division. Mm-hmm. This was a bit odd. Apparently, Blacker was suggesting that they act more like dragoons, and they leapfrog over a front line and form a position behind them. He was also suggesting that they all ride around in one-man helicopters.
Right.
So you build your helicopters literally as cheap as you can with, say, a tiny Gypsy Moth engine, bit of framework, enough space for a seat, a couple of basic controls and some stores. You then fly to your location, everyone hops out with your PIAT or with your baby Bombard, sets about the Germans, and should you need to be somewhere else, you remount and off you go. It was... I suspect it wouldn't have worked because you'd have needed to do supply runs and such forth, but it was an idea he came up with, and I think that is the earliest I've ever seen for air mobile infantry.
Mm-hmm. It's that era, isn't it, where radical suggestions, like the creation of the PIAT, are starting to get a hearing simply because there's so much possibility and everyone can see.
Yeah, that's part of the fun. That's part of what got me into this in the first place. Mm-hmm. You've got the Blacker Bombard. I know this isn't the place to talk about that, but there's early reports of penetration tests with the Bombard, and you're getting extremely angry letters coming back the other way from civil servants saying there's no way high explosive could do this. You must be lying somehow. And they're worried that somebody's pulling the wool over the army's eyes and trying to sell them something which isn't going to work. because no one had yet at that point invented a chemical energy warhead.
Mm-hmm.
So that is quite an interesting concept.
A couple of other ones sort of on the more practical side of things. So you mentioned from David Coleman, you mentioned that testing was completed at Bisley. Was this on Stickledown or one of the other ranges? Do you happen to know that?
We don't. This is for the number 68 projector.
Mm-hmm.
All we've got is one document mentioning it, and it says that it was tested at Bisley on that day or that month. It doesn't actually go into any details, unfortunately, and I would love to get hold of the testing reports for it to see how many people it hospitalised for starters.
Actually, a question I had about the number 68, so you mentioned setting the recoil to something that was manageable by the human frame, but how are they doing that? Is it something in the projector, or is it a different cartridge for the rifle that's reducing the recoil?
As it was designed to use standard issue grenades like this one, it would probably be a different cartridge size.
We have a request. Can we see the slide about the trajectory, please? As it didn't seem to show the first time. So if you've got that to hand,
yes,
we can stick that up as we answer some other stuff for the trajectory fans.
Here we have a series of shots from a practice session, and you can just see next to the mouse the projectile on its way. So.
And another one, quick one from YouTube. So we've seen obviously the last sort of ever use, but the last official military use of the PIAT
was probably 1945 in Britain, because originally there was an order for 10 million rounds produced. About 8 million of those had been produced and issued during World War II. And as the end of the war hove into sight, they decided to scrap the last 2 million and not pay for them, because they wanted to start saving money and looking at problems like the Beveridge Report, etc., etc. So very quickly, the British Army found itself thinking, hang on a minute, if a war breaks out, where are we going to get the ammunition from? So they had to forbid practice firing. Then along comes Korea, and every unit which went to Korea was equipped with American 3.5-inch super bazookas. That's because they couldn't take the PIAT because they didn't have sufficient ammunition stocks to be able to fire it. Plus also the ammunition was probably getting towards the end of its shelf life, which was about 10 years. So.
And a question from Oscar on YouTube. Is there any report of any combat in which the PIAT was decisive?
I'm just trying to pick which one, really.
I guess the problem would be a lot of it is kind of small unit stuff of few men against a particular tank, rather than an entire battle being decided by it.
Yeah, there's an example I used in my book, which came from, I think it was the Duke of Cornwall's Light Infantry. A British advance was taking a road junction to, I believe it was part of Market Garden, one of the side operations from that. And they took a left turn at a junction, a right turn, and then a left turn. So they were in a sort of zigzag. At which point that night, a bunch of Tigers came steaming down the road and hit the column in the side at one of the junctions. So the infantry then set up an anti-armour ambush, and they dragged some anti-tank mines across in front of the Tigers. The first Tiger hit the mines and got immobilised, was immediately destroyed by 3 or 4 pickets. The next tank in line was instantly engaged by the same PIATs. Bearing in mind, you can fire about 1 round every 3 seconds from a PIAT, so it was quite a hail of bombs which was landing on this platoon of Tigers. I can't remember if the 3rd and 4th tanks were not, or 3rd tank was taken out by a PIAT, but the rear 2 tanks of the column the German tanks, that is, immediately threw the tanks into reverse and crashed off the road into ditches and immobilised themselves, at which point the PIATs switched fire to them and knocked them out. So that attack was effectively stopped by a hail of PIAT bombs.
I guess the underlying question here is that we've probably shown to most people's satisfaction that it is the best platoon level anti-tank weapon. But would the British have been better doing something else, either formal mounted artillery type to 75mm anti-tank guns, or diverting effectively resources into something else other than the PIAT?
For anti-tank use, there wasn't really anything else which infantrymen could carry. They were developing something called the Camel Gun, which was a 3-inch weapon which fired a hollow charge projectile. I've done some work on that earlier, and there's an article about it up online. But even that was tripod mounted and had limited range. So the PIAT, it's here, it's mass producible. A Camel Gun takes some production, and there's about 4 years between the two weapons. So the PIAT was really Hobson's choice. I did mention the Squirts anti-tank projector, which was possibly the closest contender. I do actually have a picture of this. That's the side issue, and that's the bottom. This was effectively worn like a flamethrower. You had that on your back. There was a nozzle. In one of those sockets on the bottom, there's a small cordite charge. When you fire that electrically, the cordite charge pressurizes the container, and the contents are thrown down the pipe and at the target. And the contents are cyanic acid, which is a chemical weapon more commonly known by its German trademarked name, Zyklon B. Obviously, you've got the problem of starting gas warfare. And the idea here was to go around armour instead of through it. But your range on it is only about 30, 40 yards, whereas the PIAT can go much further. There was also storage issues, as there is a diaphragm to prevent leakage, and that was becoming corroded in some models. As far as we know, about 14 were built and issued to the Royal Irish Rifles for field trials in 1942. We were then retrieved, and that was it.
We've sort of mentioned the boys' anti-tank rifle, but if anyone on YouTube, you'll find, I think, the 1942 Disney film Stop That Tank, in which they're trying to persuade people that, yes, you are safe from the tank with the boys' anti-tank rifle, which is probably not the case. So just the psychological knowledge that you might be able to defeat the tank is very, very, probably worth the effort the British put into it.
The boys' rifle is interesting because it does actually show up later on in the war. They started using it as a heavy anti-material rifle, a bit like a Barrett 50 cal rifle today. And I believe the US Marines had some, and they even managed to bag a couple of flying boats with them.
So we've come to the 3 o'clock mark, but I've got 2 more questions, I think, if that's okay with you, David.
Yeah, sure.
If anyone does have to leave us, thank you very much for coming, but we understand we said we'd only be here for an hour. So if you need to go and watch us on demand, then feel free. Thank you for coming. But we did have a question. Got the impression from a couple of accounts that glancing blows or bounces was sometimes a problem. Was this the case, and was it due to the projectile shape?
It's almost like I know what's coming. Part of the problem was the fuse. There's essentially 2 fuses involved in the PIAT. You've got your 425 fuse, which is the flat-headed one. And this was direct action, which means you've got to get a fairly square-on hit with it. it was estimated that there was about a 25% failure rate with this fuse, mainly because the angle of impact was so bad. These particular bombs were fired by the Australians at a wooden log bunker to test it out against Japanese positions. As you can see, because the fuses weren't getting a good solid hit on metal, they weren't triggering, but the weapons were just deforming. That was known about fairly early on, and the 426 fuse came out. That has a rounded edge, and I think you saw it in... That's the 426 fuse, and that's the 426, the other one's the 425. This had a graze functionality on it, so any jolt would trigger it and cause the warhead to detonate.
I think probably our last question for the day, which is from Paul. Is there any testimony from Axis forces describing how they reacted to the PIAT?
None that I know of. But very again, my German isn't that good.
Did the Germans by any chance try and copy it? Because I know they do have a tendency to try and copy, or were they perfectly happy with the Panzerfaust?
The Germans were fine with the Panzerfaust. For me, pointing out its flaws, it had a massive penetration. It was a huge, something like 5-inch warhead, which when you're dealing with hollow charge projectiles, the size of the diameter of warhead is one of the more important factors. And to be fair, I think something like 35% of all British casualties at the end of the war in the final months, or for the battle for Germany, were caused by Panzerfaust style weapons. So if you've knocked out a third of the enemy's armoured forces by using this weapon, it doesn't seem like it's that bad. There again, you are firing it on the defensive from prepared positions, and we know that Germans, the fighting position for Panzerfaust was a series of cleared lanes. So you've got a German position to the side of your line of axis. Say it's a road where the tanks are driving down it. The German positions will be in sequence to the sides, flanks, and they'll have a very narrow cleared lane towards the road. Thus, the first tank shows up, the first German fires his Panzerfaust, knocks out a tank. They go round that position, and almost instantly they're entering another beaten zone for the next anti-tank position. So it was working as an ambush weapon, so why change it?
Yeah, true. And I guess an indication of how difficult it is ultimately for us as historians to make fair comparisons between very different weapons. But thank you very much, David. I'll have to ask you to unshare your screen so I can do the ending slides, but if I do it now, it shouldn't be too obvious. But thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. We've had some great questions. It's been really, really interesting. Thank you to Adam for producing the event behind the scenes, and thank you to the audience for taking time out of your day for the questions you had for the speaker and for your disturbingly accurate, in some cases, guesses about when the last use of the PIAT was. Thank you as well to everyone who's donated as a result of these talks. We really appreciate your support, and it all goes to preserving the collection for future generations. For any questions that you may have that we weren't able to cover today, if it's warfare or weapons related, then inquiries@armories.org.uk will get you in touch with one of our curators. David, would you like to plug your book before we go?
Yes, it's called Defeating the Panzerstuka Menace, and one of my first slides, which I forgot to put up, had a picture of the book cover and a long list of all the Spigot weapons I'd found. So unfortunately, that one was lost.
I was going to say, I have, in the ending slides, I've put a link to your Facebook, so presumably if anyone's interested, they can find out more. I'll
stick up a link there as soon as we've finished.
Perfect, nice. And I've also, yeah, as you mentioned, I'll put a link into the earlier talk you did on the Blacker Bombard. So you might have to pause the YouTube video just to catch it to make sure you can get through, but please do go check those out. And please do also remember the Jean Curry Memorial Fellowship, which is tinyurl/RA postdoc, and either check it out or pass it round. So our next event will be on Wednesday, the 3rd of November, when Dr. Tobias Capwell of the Wallace Collection will be taking us through his rediscovery of the uniquely English style of armour of the 15th century, for which no actual piece has survived. So a real piece of historical detective work. Please do join us for that. For details of this and for all our future events, please keep an eye on the website, royalarmouries.org. Follow us on your social media network of your choice, and consider following us at Eventbrite if you want notifications of this sort of thing straight to your inbox. In the meantime, thank you again for spending time with us today, and I look forward to seeing you on the 3rd of November.